Thank you everyone for having us here today, even the bad weather. My name is Vily, and today with Evangelia we will be talking about building co-perception processes in public space in the case of Corpus Research Project in the municipality of Egaleo. A few words about the project. In Corpus, we're a consortium of 7 partners: the University of Turin, Open Lab Athens, the Municipality of Egaleo, the Technical University of Delft, FPW Architects and Urbanists, the Rokani Collective here in Athens, and the 4th District in Turin. The project is developed and implemented under the Driving Urban Transition Initiative and co-funded by the European Union and the national agencies of Italy, Greece, and the Netherlands. Corpus aims to conduct research on alternative processes of retrofitting public space at the neighborhood level, grounded on circular urban economies through the involvement of the local communities in Egaleo and Turin. Today we will focus mainly on Egaleo. We acknowledge that in terms of the broader goal of circularity, small-scale objectives may create an opportunity for public spaces and communities in suburban areas that were left behind due to the successive crises of the last decades, from the economic crisis of 2008 to the pandemic and the climate and energy crisis. Big amounts of unused materials, along with the minimization of public investment and the economic instability that actually reshaped European urban peripheries, this crisis have resulted suffocated social and economic environment in the cities. Those dynamics, combined with the global uncertainty in supply chains and the collapse of state politics, that support social reproduction, turned public spaces in the city's periphery into hostile places. Circular urban economy is an opportunity to address this problem because it leads to an alternative path to the resilient independence of local communities. So, this context created the conditions for the Corpus project to emerge as a potential response to connect flows of circularity with the community that surrounds a public space and to develop trajectories of citizens' participation and caring about the shared environment. To explain the concept of circularity and upcycling of materials and the main functionalities of the Corpus Living Lab in Egaleo, we usually use this example of Miss Irini, who renovates her apartment and donates the construction waste at the Corpus Living Lab in Egaleo. The wooden materials and the metal parts are processed in the lab in order to become again raw materials. This way, we create a library of materials in the lab, which serves as a common repository of upcycling. People from the neighborhood will be able to use the lab, and they will be engaged to participate in co-design and co-construction workshops for small-scale interventions in the public space of the neighborhood. In order to close this circle of circularity, we will use a system of exchange through a blockchain platform developed by the University of Turin, based on which every time Ms. Irini donates materials, she takes in return tokens in the blockchain platform of commonshood, and her token could be burned by using the equipment of the lab, or in local SMEs, or use some incentives from the municipality. Our overall approach for the Corpus is based on the principles of participatory action research, a concept based on which people have a right to determine their own development and recognizes the need for local people to participate meaningfully in the process of analyzing their own solutions over which they have power and control. Through participatory action research, we aim to build mutual processes of co-perception in order to understand the local history and context. We learn from the behaviors of the locals in the public space, and we try to emerge new collective rituals. This is a key word for us. The symbolic acts of the community, of reclaiming and appropriating shared spaces. So we question ourselves, how can we as researchers and designers minimize the knowledge gap between experts and citizens in process of participatory design, and how could this co-perception can be built? We aim to combine a sequence of activities that will be presented below, with the objective to connect the micro level of neighborhood interaction and shared spaces with the notions of circularity and upcycling, trying to diffuse the idea that a sustainable urban transition is not an academic discourse, but a tangible practice that refers to the everyday life of the city, and at the same time could become an opportunity to produce value for the community. So our goal is to assist communities rediscover and reintroduce these rituals of space making to foster collective living and social interaction. We approach this objective through an educative and generative process of engaging communities to reconnect with spatial knowledge and act of exchange, which can serve as platform for producing social innovation in terms of the contemporary challenges of urban environments. So we introduced 7 main community acts to build a shared perception of the public space. The first act, we call it Work Together and Map Collectively. It's actually workshops with children, more than 100 children in the Gallo municipality, in which we focused on the tool of cognitive mapping. In the first session, we walked together from the school to the workshop space, passing through the playground and the square, and we asked the children to observe the environment with all their senses. After that, we talked about the maps, what maps are, and how they can help us understand the world around us, giving us all this different information. And finally, once they were divided into groups, they created their own maps of the route we had just taken, recalling everything they had noticed and observed along the way. So here are a few examples of the map that they created. This workshop started last year already.
Well, in the second workshop with the children, the tool we worked with was photography. So we organized photo walks in the square and the playground with the kids split into small groups. Each group had a disposable analog camera, and every child had the chance to take 1 photo in the playground and 1 photo in the square. The idea was to capture something they really liked and wouldn't want to see it changed, or something they didn't like and would want to improve. Before taking the picture, each child shared the idea with the group and explained why they wanted to photograph the specific frame. This process helped both us and the children look at the 2 public spaces with much more detail, encouraged them to think more actively, critically, and express their desires about their built environment. For us, it was really important to see these spaces through their way of seeing. These are some examples of the children's photos. These are 2 examples. Now, we are moving on the first round of workshops with the elderly. We kept the same general ideas of mapping and photography, but this time we focused much more on oral stories on the neighborhood's past, as well as their desires about the future of the neighborhood. So, in the first workshop, we asked them to work with us on the neighborhood map and mark some of their wishes, things that they used to exist there, things that they would like to see added or changed. They could place stickers that represented different uses of or types of interventions. As they did that, they shared memories, personal experience, stories, history of the neighborhood, etc. We followed a similar approach in the second, more ethnographic workshop. This time, we asked them to bring their own photographs of the neighborhood from the past. Through these photos, memories started to surface, stories, moments, so we managed to put together a kind of neighborhood timeline, important events from them, how the area changed over the years, specific stories from their childhood, many more details that helped us understand the deeper layers of the area. Now we are moving to the public event that we organized. The exhibition was the main activity of the event and presents the first phase of engagement approach of the community to the design of a public space in the social housing complex of Gallo. The exhibition discusses conceptions of shared spaces and aims to trigger dialogues about the past, the present, and the future of its use. The exhibition compiles all the material, cognitive mapping, photos, timelines we had gathered from the workshops with the children and the elderly. We categorized the children's photographs and combined them with photographs, facts, and stories from the neighborhood's past. In order for the visitors to interact with the exhibition material, we inserted short questions in between relating to how they perceive the neighborhood and public space. Visitors could answer the question in post-it notes and stick it back to onto the exhibition. The second activity of the public event was designed and facilitated from Rokani Cooperative. The children had the chance to make xylophones from wooden leftovers. And the third activity of the event was to transform a bitter orange tree to a lemon tree in order for the inhabitants to start using it. Now the second cycle of the workshops with the students, which have been just begun, we are trying to introduce the idea of recycling and upcycling. So we placed 2 bins in their classrooms, one for collecting paper waste only, and another for collecting pencil savings. The goal is for them to use these 2 types of material and with a bit of a processing, turn them into something new, something that they would later use to build their own intervention models. Starting with the paper, they cut the classroom paper waste into small pieces, and with water they turned it into pulp. This pulp produced the cardboard sheets for their models. These are examples of the cardboard sheets that they created. And these are the examples of the pencil savings bricks. They mixed the savings with wood glue, and they create small bricks in different sizes and shapes, so they can be used to intervention maquettes that the children will make on the upcoming workshops. At this stage, we try to introduce the scale, the concept of scale. So we held a discussion with the children about what scale is and how scale helps us to design and build models smaller or larger than the reality. Afterwards, we asked them to draw inspiration from the photographs that they have taken last year and to draw or represent somehow their ideas for interventions in the square and the playground through collages. Here are some ideas for the playground and the transformation of the kiosk. The transformation of the phone booth into a helicopter toy for small children. Another idea for the playground. Parks for cats and dogs. A small stage for outdoor events. 3 houses. A public library and a table for tea. Another transformation for the old kiosk. And now we're moving at the last act, which is really important for us because it has to do with the makerspace. So it's really important that we had from the municipality this kind of space, which was an old warehouse. So we gradually transformed this old warehouse to a community makerspace with very limited resources. So as we were cleaning out the space, several materials were found, which became the first materials of the material library. Many of these we have already started using to construct infrastructures and furniture within the makerspace. So the first learning scenario on tools and equipment with Rokani Cooperative was to construct a workbench from old blackboards. These are the plans for the construction of the bench. And this was the building process. So this is the final phase of assembling the workbench and the first workshop of circular strategies for designing the public space. To conclude all these activities, we are trying to activate the community to reclaim built environment through intervening in public space. The creative reuse of material resources and the community makerspace create a framework of value co-production and knowledge sharing. All these acts emerge as means to create a co-perception of public space. The overall approach also aims to test the possibility of systemic change in terms of public administration to support community-driven exploitation of resources. We believe that the interaction of physical and digital the interconnection of physical and digital interaction of the members of the community can disrupt normative trajectories of urban life and create opportunities for new imaginaries in reflections in terms of urban commons. So the perception, along with the build of a community makerspace to develop small-scale interventions in the neighborhood, co-designed by the community, of course, may lead to the emergence of new forms of collective rituals. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Evangelia and Vily. So I suggest that we keep our questions for the end of the session. I think it will be better. So we have little time for discussion. Then we can move to the next presentation from Liam O Farrell.
Almost. Liam.
Almost. Yeah. Sorry for the accent.
No worries.
From the Prelab project.
Yes.
So, and with a case study in Tirana, Albania.
Yes. There they are. Right, this is the clicker.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So this mic is okay?
You can hear me? Yes. Okay, good. Right. So, I'm going to be presenting some research today from Albania, which is quite an understudied country in Europe, and I think it's quite an interesting case study as well. It really challenges a lot of the assumptions we make in urban studies and planning around basic concepts. In the post-socialist world, and nowhere more so than Albania, a lot of these concepts around public space, social housing, state intervention, they're very controversial. The idea of a cooperative, for example, I was in Tirana last week, it's something seen as very suspicious. So I think when we're talking about, any kind of participatory planning or sort of democratic processes, these don't travel very well in a context like Albania. So I'm going to be sharing some initial insights from my work. It's been going on since April this year. Tirana is a really interesting case study, I think, and it surprises me that a lot of Greeks have never been, because it's the neighboring country. It's also planning to join the EU. The target is 2027. That was set by Ursula von der Leyen a few weeks ago. It's probably more likely 2030, but in any case, within the next 4 years. And for a country to be joining the EU, there are such huge knowledge gaps. I find that quite strange. Tirana has an affordability ratio, something comparable with Milan, Paris, Lisbon. This is quite extreme. You're looking at a country with a declining population, salaries around 400, 500 euros a month, and yet probably no other city in Europe has the scale of construction that's taking place at the moment than Tirana does. So to give you a brief overview, and I'm sure you're kind of familiar already, but Albania, it's emerging from quite an extreme socialist period. It's called the North Korea of Europe. And actually, when we go back to Albania getting its independence in 1912 from the Ottoman Empire, it never really had a democratic period. It was sort of a protectorate of the League of Nations, which is precursor to the United Nations. It was a kingdom under Italian influence, and then it was conquered by fascist Italy, and then it had the Hoxha period. So we never really have a democratic period in Albania, and I think that's very important. There's not really been a process of building a democratic culture, the roots on which the participatory planning processes can begin. And of the 33 years that Albania has been experimenting with democracy, there's been one person at the top of politics for 27 of those years. So almost the entire democratic period has been shaped by Edi Rama, who's now on his 4th term as prime minister. Before that, he was mayor of Tirana for 11 years. He's really the key figure, and there's been an intense centralization of power into Rama's office. And really what we see happening in Tirana is very much in Rama's vision. Now, just to briefly give you, this is a bit of an outdated map, but Tirana in 1990 was a pretty small city, 200,000 people. It was a socialist planned city, except for a very small strip that was built in the fascist Italian period. But since 1990, the population has quadrupled. It was very rapid growth that we don't really see elsewhere in Europe in this period. So around 750 to 800,000 people. The difficulty is most of the new settlements are informal settlements, especially Kamsa. You have 100, 200,000 people in a totally unplanned, spontaneous settlement. There has not been a quadruple upgrade of Tirana's infrastructure, and so basic issues such as drinking water, which doesn't exist, it maybe runs for 2 or 3 hours a day, electricity, roads, public infrastructure such as schools, they functionally don't exist in the informal settlements. And yet, we have this really dramatic price growth, especially over the last 3 years, almost a doubling or a trebling of prices. And yet, as I said, basic infrastructure doesn't exist. Now, my first visit to Tirana, I was really shocked. I think you will be shocked too. The sort of construction you see happening there, it's unprecedented. I mean, I've lived in Greece for 5 years. I've never seen construction like this in Athens. And I think it really challenges, and it's meant to challenge some of your preconceptions about Tirana, because this is not organic, this is not being led by the market. This is something that's very much being designed by the Prime Minister's office as a sort of showcase of Albanian independence. You have this tower on the left here. There's some skepticism whether it's actually Edi Rama's face that's built into the tower, or it's Skanderbeg, who is their national hero. But anyway, there's luxury towers and there's not drinkable tap water. I find that quite odd. And in general, it's a really strange housing market. So in 1990, Albania had a population of around 3 million. Today, it's around 2 million, perhaps 1.8 million. The figures are a bit unclear because people don't deregister when they leave. But we can say that it's a shrinking country, rapidly shrinking country. There's very high overcrowding rate, sort of 4 times the European average. And yet there's construction, 1 permit issued per day for the last year. We have figures. I'm almost certain that there's more than 1 permit issued a day at this point. And a very high vacancy rate. So this looks like a broken housing market. And when I arrived in Tirana, my thought, coming from a Western European perspective was, this is just a spatial justice issue, or this is something about inequality. What kind of mechanisms can address this? In fact, it's something very different. 60% of the investment in real estate in Albania is dark money. That's been repeatedly shown by researchers. And when we say dark money, it's typically linked to criminal networks. So I think when we're thinking about urban development or we're thinking about policy making, it's really important to think about informality. I mean, in a context like Albania, the majority of development is informal anyway, and then the majority of money going into development is informal. And so all of these sort of formal, top-down, institutional-led processes, they're kind of a sideshow to what's going on. And developing this idea is a colleague of mine in London who'd come up with this term of facadism. It's the appearance of change and development, while under the surface there's actually a sort of deterioration. Rama is somebody who was an artist. He was trained as a socialist realist artist, which is all about, what would we say, national inform, socialist in content. We take the socialist out and you're just left with this spectacle of aesthetics. And there's more to come. So by 2030, this is the year that's set for the latest joining of the EU, there will be 22 towers above 100 meters in Tirana. So 22 Athens towers in Tirana, a city of 750,000 people, all of which are designed by international star architects. You have Bjarke Ingels, you have Norman Foster, Zaha Hadid architects. And the way these tenders are done is totally intransparent as well. So Rama has a WhatsApp group called Arch Army. He puts tenders in there to people who he's met, who he likes their style, and that's the process. That's quite an unusual process for doing a tender. But I would also ask, so this will be the largest concentration of tall buildings anywhere in southeastern Europe outside of Istanbul. I find that quite odd. So again, it makes me wonder what's going on in Albania. We have some more. These developments actually exist. So probably this is the pyramid of Tirana. It was built by Hodja's daughter. She's still alive. She was not chased out of the country after the collapse, which is a surprise to me. So I've been there for 8 months now, done quite a lot of expert interviews. The challenge has been that there's a huge crackdown on corruption at the moment as part of the EU accession. So, for example, 80% of the staff in the mayor's office are currently in prison, including the mayor himself. The deputy prime minister, the minister of infrastructure, the former prime minister is in exile in Switzerland for corruption. So it's kind of strange. It's impossible to talk to anybody working in public sector because they're so afraid of who are you, why are you investigating this, who are you reporting this to, because this is a whole culture of fear around corruption charges at the moment. And the only person not touched by that appears to be Rama, although I had an interview last week with a developer who told me Rama had asked for €1 million bribe for a permit, so who knows. Now, there are some challenges with doing research in Albania that are quite common across post-socialist spaces, but I think particularly intense here. So there is just a total lack of data. The sort of capacity for data collection broke down in 1990. There are cultural issues around authority. There's also a lot of suspicion around somebody coming in with sort of a progressively angled project. As I mentioned before, something about public space. Public space doesn't exist in Tirana because space has been privatized in the fall of communism. Social housing functionally doesn't exist, although by law it does. The way that's allocated, again, it's typically people with connections inside the municipality who are living inside that, and it's not really based on any criteria. But there's also a lot of safety risks to researchers in Albania, and this has been a big surprise to me. So I was at a conference in Italy, and there was a researcher who's doing her work in Reggio Calabria. Didn't expect to make this connection, but she was talking about how the port of Reggio Calabria, it's the biggest port for drug trafficking in the Mediterranean, formerly controlled by the Italian mafia, but is now controlled by the Albanian mafia, who, they have €1 billion turnover. They're also very active in Antwerp, Rotterdam, a few other sites around Europe. And so the processes by which this money gets back to Albania and goes into the property sector is very opaque. But I was so naive, I was asking, how do you get the cash into a bank? Surely the bank, well, you just bribe the banker. Okay. But then that's illegal, so what happens if there's a legal case? You just bribe the judge. This is what a participant told me in my research, who was working in real estate. So there's a really interesting space to do work, and it sort of scrambled a lot of my preconceived ideas of how you do urban research. There's also basic safety issues. So there was a case of an investigative journalist investigating Air Albania, which is very closely tied to the Albanian mafia, who the CEO, who's also an oligarch, because there's a few oligarchs in Albania, sort of had this person threatened to be kidnapped and dismembered, so chopped up. That's not normal. So I asked my host in Tirana, the professor there, is it safe to be doing this research? And that wasn't a very reassuring answer that he gave. For you, yes, safe. For me, maybe a bit more complicated. Okay, that's not very reassuring. Also, a few more projects that are ongoing here. So this is €5 million of public money, probably from the EU, that Rama has used to build a personal garden for himself inside the Prime Minister's office. He calls it his Garden of Eden. It's where he hosts visiting. As I mentioned, Ursula von der Leyen was there a few weeks ago. This is the vision that Rama has come up with for the new train station, because there's not currently a train network that connects Tirana with the outside world. So I think, don't know how much time I have left, but I will try to go a little bit quickly. But I think when we're talking about participatory planning, that we need to take a step back and think about the assumptions we're making about the culture, and how it's kind of reliant on democratic roots and trust in others, and that basically doesn't exist in Albania. And I like Albania very much, I must say. I very enjoy it, so that's not a criticism, because I do find that when I'm doing my research there, I always have to be careful of how I'm coming across, because they don't want to be criticized. But I think that the sort of democratic process, it's a few stages perhaps before participatory planning, because of this cultural hostility to anything that seems socialist. This 3% rule I mentioned that's in the constitution. So functionally now, developers you can get the status of being a strategic developer. Rama is the one that signs those permits, and you don't have to actually comply with any of the rules. You can do off-plan development any way you want. And so technically they should be giving 3% of any development to the municipality for use of social housing, but that's now being transferred to Rama's office as well. So again, there's a really intense centralization, which I find fascinating. And yeah, a lot of my participants have just said these questions I'm asking, it's just luxury bullshit for Westerners, so participatory planning, climate action, yeah, okay, maybe if you're in Sweden or Netherlands, you can talk about that, but not here. That's, even academics telling me things like that. Just to finish though, and this isn't unique to Albania, so connecting with other researchers, you see this sort of supranational speculation happening all across the Western Balkans, Belgrade waterfront, the coast of Montenegro, Skopje 2014 project that's still ongoing to sort of redevelop the city. And the sort of sources of funding for this are never very clear. Which is why I think we should really think a lot more about informality, the networks of people, how they know each other, how decisions are made, how are permits granted, by what process, and where's the funding coming from. I think those are really sort of the fundamental questions that often get overlooked. I'm a little bit nervous for Albania's development, whether it's a bubble or not, because of how many officials are currently in prison. I think I mentioned 20 MPs currently in prison as well. That doesn't feel very typical. And the patronage system that's been built up within the public system, so sort of the trebling of state employees by Rama, that's going to create long-term impacts. But I think for me to close, and this was really just to sort of spark your interest in Albania as a case study, there's been a lot of discussion. I was at the conference in Tirana in September about whether we should still talk about post-socialism. Does that really apply to countries like Czechia or Poland? I think it very much does, but in Albania it's taking a very sort of twisted form that's very fascinating and really worth looking into, so I encourage anyone who's interested in these issues to visit Tirana. You will be shocked by what you find. This is the vision that Rama has for Tirana by 2030. It's quite beautiful. I told you he's an artist. So I think when you see the scale of change happening in Tirana and then you compare this to Athens, I think already you start asking questions about what's going on. So I think it's really worth a visit. And I would like to answer any questions you have at the end, because I could talk and talk about this, but I tried to make it really short and interesting. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So now we will welcome Vasiliki Apostolaki. If you want, you can sit and I can move. If you prefer.
I think it's better to see the presentation from.
Okay. Yeah. And we move at the same time from Albania to Kenya with another case study.
Thank you. I don't know if it can be as interesting as Tirana, but I will try. So my name is Vasiliki. I'm an architect and urban specialist, and today I'm going to present to you my master thesis. My master thesis was part of the Nairobi Thesis Atelier, which is a community-based participatory research project where students collaborated with local organizations in a reciprocal way. So our topics were structured in accordance with the needs and the agendas of our local partners. And my partner in this research was Slum Dwellers International, and my focus was housing in informal settlements. So informal settlements, colloquially put as slums, are places where people live and work informally, meaning they have no tenure security, no access to infrastructure and services, and their dwellings are generally inadequate. Often described as poverty traps, the slums are environments that lock people into poverty, and in Nairobi, over 60% of the population lives in informal settlements. So for my research, I studied a pilot project under one of the most celebrated programs that try to deal with the issues of the slums, which is called KENSAP, meaning Kenya Slum Upgrading Program. KENSAP is a collaboration between the government of Kenya and UN Habitat, and it was mostly about incremental upgrading of the housing and infrastructure provision in the slums, but this pilot tried to provide formal housing. The project took place in Kibera, Africa's so-called largest slum. And here I want to mention that Kibera is divided into 13 villages, and Soweto, that we see in the picture, is one of them. And for the sake of the project, Soweto was divided into 4 zones, A, B, C, and D, and our project is in Zone A. So more into the specifics, our case study is a case of on-site resettlement. On-site resettlement starts with the enumeration of current slum residents, which then gives us a list of beneficiaries for the program to come. Then follows their voluntary and assisted relocation to a temporary site, while the existing housing stock is being demolished for the sake of formal development. There, in the temporary site, the residents have the time to collect the necessary deposit to be able to participate in the allocation of the apartments. Once the new development is completed, the residents are resettled in the new housing, which in our case is a housing estate. Zone A, let me change. Zone A was a pilot in many ways, but here in this presentation I will just mention a few of them. First of all, the enumeration was community-driven, and this bottom-up approach helped slum residents gain trust in the process of slum upgrading. Secondly, the program involved the creation of a settlement executive committee, otherwise called as SEC, which elected representatives of all the areas of the Soweto village. So, for example, when the experts wanted to relocate the residents to a faraway location, the SEC blocked this decision and forced them to find a nearby site. So here in the map we can see the distance to the temporary site, which is 3.5 kilometers. This is a very good case scenario for relocation, as normally we are talking about distances like 30 kilometers or more and then in the middle of nowhere. Of course, the site was next to the female prison, but this didn't seem to be an issue in the case. And foremost, the pilot was the first rent-to-own model ever implemented in Kenya, which means that residents pay rent to the state, which counts as a mortgage payment. So eventually the residents will gain the housing titles of their apartments in about 25 to 30 years. The SEC also negotiated rents so that they were considerably low. However, there was a lot of recent evidence in the press that the project was unsuccessful in the sense that beneficiaries returned to the slum and sublet their units to wealthier residents due to affordability issues. So this was the starting point for this research, and my initial question was, why is this housing proving to be unaffordable if financially it seems to make more sense? So to answer this question in an academic manner, I formed a research question, which is the following. How do impoverishment risks influence sustainable housing affordability in the case of Soweto East A? So basically, I wanted to see if further impoverishment that might be caused by displacement can affect the affordability of the produced housing, but I wanted to view both impoverishment and affordability under a more holistic lens rather than a purely financial one. Very briefly, my methodology was qualitative with interviews with a small sample, fieldwork observations, and I also did interviews and focus group discussions and also a participatory workshop, a participatory design workshop with residents to triangulate and validate my data. In my interviews with residents, I chose some that were beneficiaries and some that were tenants on purpose to create a comparison between the two groups. So I did impoverishment risk questions to beneficiaries to see how resettlement affected them or not. The impoverishment risk model criteria measure the impact of resettlement on capital assets that enable people to pursue their livelihood. These capital assets are namely natural, physical, financial, human, and social, and housing and infrastructure is considered to be part of the physical capital. And then affordability questions were asked to both groups. Briefly, sustainable housing affordability is a comprehensive assessment of affordability that integrates social, environmental, and economic criteria, thus bordering on the concepts of housing adequacy and acceptability. And now I will move to my findings. So my initial finding is that both models, so both impoverishment risk model and sustainable housing affordability, are two theoretically compatible concepts with valid application potential on the informal settlements. For the case study, beneficiaries were not found more impoverished due to resettlement mostly because of the small resettlement distance that I mentioned before. Their relocation was generally smooth. No social amenities were lost during the slum clearance. Jobs, social networks, and access to schools and services were generally preserved due to the proximity of the temporary site. In the estate, access to services was improved, and both the estate and the units were found socially acceptable for residents. Actually, residents mentioned in their interviews that they were feeling proud and secure to have a formal address, open spaces for their children to play, and community spaces for their neighborhood. However, households faced space deprivation in the unit, since large families occupied mostly one-unit bedrooms. So here, for example, in the last picture, we can see the famous balcony rooms, so spaces that were supposed to be balconies but were closed and turned into rooms, where 3 or 4 members of the family were residing in, which makes the space clearly inadequate. Residents also struggled with the deterioration of the services in the estate, as in the waste management and the water supply, and also the lack of flood mitigation, as we can see also in the picture. Moreover, their informal and unstable income made them struggle with the deposit to begin with, and also with the mortgage payments, even though their ability to default let food and schooling remain as top household priorities. Most residents were tenants, as beneficiaries preferred to secure an income by subletting their units. All this was possible due to low fear of eviction from the estate, because it's public property. All in all, the living environment and access to services was enhanced, of course still with problems that I already mentioned, but there was no holistic upgrade that can uplift slum dwellers from poverty. So almost 10 years after relocation, residents were still vulnerable to extreme poverty, informality, and lack of urban governance in the area. Despite the project's success in many aspects, lack of proper evaluation and institutional indifference led to its severe deterioration and created uncertainty for the future developments. For instance, in Zone B that we can see in the top picture, lessons learned from Zone A were totally disregarded and participatory processes were abandoned. And as a general comment for my recommendations, I believe that it's very important to develop criteria to determine the most appropriate upgrading strategy for each context. My partners at SDI and most of contemporary literature are in favor of incremental upgrading, but I wouldn't say it's the holy grail. What we need are structured evaluation processes, feedback platforms, and the collection of longitudinal data on on-site resettlement to learn what works in each case. This project taught us that participatory and inclusive processes are crucial, as well as education and sensitization of the population in question. Sometimes, even regulated stewardship of the projects could be beneficial. And last but not least, housing that is produced through slum upgrading is mainly social housing. So financial criteria for the design and the allocation cannot be the only ones in place. And residents know that and can put it very specifically into words and designs, as I noticed myself in the participatory design workshop that I did in the slum. So my main takeaway from this thesis and this presentation would be that residents know what they need and what they're talking about, and we should really be there to listen to them and learn from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasiliki. And then we move to the next presentation with Jakub Galuszka. Sorry for the accent and your name.
It's good.
From the University of Hamburg in Germany. And with the title, Deregulation and Formalization, Who Benefits? Housing Practices Between Informality and the Right to the City in Greece and the UK.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Actually, Hafen City University Hamburg. I need to tell it because they would be angry because there's a competition, you know, University of Hamburg. So thanks for joining. Somehow I'm happy I'm the last one because the term of informality has already appeared in two presentations. So I think it fits nicely, and I would dive into the project that we are realizing across Berlin, Athens, and UK, predominantly Cardiff, but also London. And in this presentation, mostly I would jump into our exploratory study already that we did in UK, because we are the most advanced there. But perhaps the Greece bit, you know, comes with the questions, or you can have a reflection if we're going the right direction. So you might see these cases as quite distant from one another, but what connects them is really the fact that there is really a housing crisis in each of the major cities and overall in the countries, all of those countries, with you know, radical decrease in affordability for renting, but also for buying. And I think it's coming even stronger. I mean, it's very strong and advanced in Berlin and London, but also coming in Athens. And talking about the public space and housing relationship, I think the main manifestation or imaginary of a crisis is really when we talk about, let's say, informality in the most precarious form, such as homelessness, or maybe we should rather say houselessness than homelessness. And you know, one image is from Athens, other one is from UK, where there was a particular attention given to beds in sheds, so informal renting in the backyards, and for some reason it became very discussed and sort of criticized as a manifestation of informality which shouldn't be there. So these are also the manifestations that are easiest to eradicate because they spark the public attention and they are visible. I think that what we argue is that a little bit looking at this relationship between informality and formality, we have a wide spectrum, you know, and we have those kind of manifestations which are very visible and very contested and sort of seen as precarious. But if we look at the whole housing market, we will see that, you know, new manifestations such as subdivisions, micro-living, Airbnb, those are also feeding into like a logics of shifting regulatory frameworks into one or the other direction. That's why we extend the term beyond the precarity. We try to see how it works beyond that context. Yeah, so going forward, Berlin, I will not speak about it, but it's, you know, it's very interesting because informality there is massive, but it's hidden. Cardiff in London, there's sort of situation of deregulation when the boundaries between what's permitted and what's not permitted are being shifted consciously by the state, but also some of the manifestations of informality are being really tried to be eradicated. And Athens, the story is completely different. It's sort of like culturally, that was the process, right, throughout the decades. But now we witness the process of formalization with revenue streams somehow being used from that for different things. And that's what we want to investigate as well. In Athens, actually, Common Space are our partners. I didn't mention that, but so we also collaborate. Yeah, well, research questions, I mean, I can skip that. So starting with England, London, and Cardiff, what we look at is really the regulation of the housing market with a specific manifestation of that process, namely the PDR, Permitted Development Rights, when owners of homes are allowed to extend the backyards and kind of extend their housing up to specific limits. So it's very interesting because as long as you do not, let's say, extend over 2 meters, you are allowed to do that, and you do not need a planning permission. So that's a kind of traditional way of doing things in UK, but since 10-15 years it has been really, even further deregulated, which resulted in acceleration of these processes. And I think that this kind of built form is not typically associated with the very neat English landscape, but actually this is the main, I think, characteristic feature of many UK cities. So you see this diversity of things being added on the top of one another, and in one installment they might be completely formal because they are allowed through this permitted development rights, but if we look at specific distances, it really comes down to negotiation between neighbors, and if neighbors decide to complain that something is wrong with what is happening in the neighbor's backyard, right? And then it becomes illegal only when enforcement action is taken. So it creates a very interesting dynamic of what's permitted and not permitted. But somehow media debate looked at this backyard renting in these beds in sheds as something which is problematic, and that's why the public sector focus was really on removing informal renting from the backyards. Anyway, we tried to trace what happened over last 20 years in several locations, and how it changed also urban landscape, urban morphologies with this acceleration of PDR. And you can see that in here, in one of the central blocks, it's focused very on the inside of a block, but in a suburban district. Now we traced also how it becomes visible, and it becomes one of the main morphologies that you can see in suburban context, which all of those additions, pink or black, you see up that we traced, is something that's majority of that was done without a planning permission, and generally leads to completely new urban landscape. And this is another step when we trace really the visibility of these changes. But what's interesting is that this is somehow positioned between formality and informality. But in the next step, what we're starting to do, mainly in Cardiff, is really try to understand what happens inside of these changes. So what happens is that this sort of, at least what we find out by now, we need to follow up on that, is that really those kind of changes are probably not so much increasing the availability of housing. They are more directed on increasing the value of your property and increasing on comfort. And sometimes this is being rented out, sometimes not, but there is sort of discussions even online of how this kind of extension can increase the value of the housing. So in this sense, informality is permitted, but it seems it is more directed toward the private benefits. So if we juxtapose really contestations to beds in sheds with the sort of lack of contestation of these kind of extensions which are used for your own use, it becomes interesting of how matters of visibility, imagination, discourses affects what's being permitted and what's being sort of chased up by public authorities. There has been quite a lot of literature on that. Let's say Kelling and Lombard discussing exactly why beds in sheds are so much criticized. And now, towards the end, we come to also to Athens, where we didn't, we are doing it also with Alkistis, who is here and is a part of team and also part of this presentation actually as well. So we want to also trace more in detail how the formalization dynamic in Athens plays out, what it means for how, for instance, in terms of rooftops, how the decisions are being made of what happens out there, and for whom the formalization is a beneficial tool, right? Because the formalization is still very expensive in the local context, I think I might say, and some people will afford it, some people will not afford it, and after the formalization is done, there, I suppose so, should be some sort of enforcement, but enforcement seems to be a little bit unrealistic in that context. So we need to dive into that and think about it further. But for now, what we can say is that really in terms of what we look at in London and Cardiff is that really those kind of shifts, the regulation shifts really change the urban morphology. It builds up on what's traditionally has been anyway happening, but it accelerates the process and it leads to densification. It's not supposed to be visible from the street level, but actually it is visible from the street level and certainly visible for the people living in backyards and somehow negotiated really between neighbors. It seems for now we need to cross-check it that it's really increasing the value of the properties. And it's creating more units only in specific contexts when you have sort of like a student district or a subdivision inside of the building. And here we come to another dimension of the regulation that if it's done by corporate actors, and we talk about the subdivisions or sharing flats, that's completely permitted, even though it links with diminishing the standards. So we have these two extremes: private development somehow seems to be driven by own comfort and increase of property value. Corporate development shrinking the quality of what you get there with the increasing of rent. So you can subdivide your flat. You have 5 flats out of 1 flat, but the rent is unproportionally high, even though it's cheap, relatively cheap on the market. So this is this interesting dynamic. So of course there's uneven treatment of different manifestations of informality. As I mentioned, the backyard rental is not really allowed, and those kind of extensions are widely accepted, and architects are involved in the whole process. And the last outcome is surely that densification, it has many benefits, but it also links to garden grabbing, decreasing the garden spaces and issues like that. So we want to follow up really, even though we have such a different context as Cardiff, London, Athens and Berlin, we see some connectivity of processes, interaction between housing and public sphere. And in Athens, we want to really also look at the morphological side of the whole process, which is, it's traditional over the last 50, 60, post-war development is based on some sort of informal processes which are being formalized, and they, create some sort of financial flows that we want to dig into. But also, it looks like Athens, since like any major cities in Europe are being increasingly, let's say, a target of real estate, big real estate companies, Airbnbs and so on, which further push away housing stock from the local population. And I think exactly the extensions which are happening also of the rooftops are an interesting area to explore across energy generation, but also housing and different sort of uses. And then we come also to civil society initiatives. In the next step, we would want to understand if there is any sort of contestation or interest in dealing with that topic. Okay, Berlin is not a part of that presentation. I think it's also very interesting because it's very regulated context. But loopholes, I'll just mention that, loopholes in a law, which is very strict, loopholes allow for such a manipulation of the housing market that now, at least now, informality thrives behind the facades of the building, where people basically sublet their housing for ridiculous amounts. And I think since maybe a week ago, since some months the authorities decided to deal with those loopholes, and a week ago we noticed that one of the main companies for short-term rentals started sort of a public campaign, or like started to engage with influencers, when the influencers say that, well, they want to regulate Wunderflats, so how we will access our housing, it decreases our right to access flats, but Wunderflats are basically a company which offers you short-term rental for extremely high price, which is way above our rent cap. So, you know, the discussion about the rights to the city is being interestingly, you know, used to criticize some further regulation or closing of the loopholes. All right, so, but that's it, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we can move to the discussion and the questions. Maybe all the speakers, if you want to join. Yeah. So we can be all around the table. So do you have any questions to address to the speakers, or both, several of them?
Somebody must have a question.
Okay.
The very first question of the conference, so it must be really stressing.
No, come on, just let it out.
Okay, I have one. All right, okay. Thank you very much for the presentations. My question would be about this term informality. So maybe Jakub and Liam would be interested in that. I'm coming from a city where this line between formality and informality has been so blurred from historically speaking, I'm from Istanbul. So, and after all these critique coming from the southern urbanisms and all these post-colonial critique related to this distinction between formality and informality, my question would be, is it still useful to use that term? I mean, what I'm learning from your presentations, even in the northern context, even in the western context, that line is being blurred. So, I mean, I learned so much. I mean, Cardiff, in Berlin, in Tirana. So, beyond some heuristic reasons and heuristic uses, I mean, of course, we need some analytical distinctions, but beyond that, maybe or should we find out some other alternative concepts to not to reproduce this kind of distinction between formality and informality, because formality, as you know, is coming from this very 50s, 60s kind of urban planning, state-centric perspective. So, yeah, I think we got my point.
I can say something brief, and I guess Jakub and Vasiliki will follow up. So I should have mentioned the project I'm working on. The title is Precarity and Informality in a pre-lab. And we have a lot of scholars of informality working on it, and the whole idea is that formality is the exception. You know, whether you're in Western Europe, whether you're in the global South, informality is kind of the default way that people act anyway. And at least from my perspective, it wouldn't really be a binary. You know, you can have, I wouldn't say there's informality and formality here. Maybe Jakub could expand a bit on that because he had this spectrum of practices. But yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I think my own feeling would be connecting this to political economy, because that's my background in political economy. You always have to think about the power relations and sort of the transformations of the state. And so even where there is this sort of spectacle of formality, there is often informal relations behind it. You know, so if you think of the UK, you think of the British finance industry with its offshore tax havens, this is very legal, and yet at the same time it's all running on interpersonal connections and trust, which is informal. So the two things are coexisting at the same time in a highly formalized context like the City of London. So for me, the formality is almost like a theatre, would be my opinion.
Yeah, I think my opinion is close to your opinion and your opinion somehow. So I can build up on that. I think that what's relevant is not really if something is formal or informal, because that's a binary which is fake. It's more about the relationship between those concepts. So we're looking, it's useful in a sense that we have some societal concept of what's formal, which is, let's say, codified rules of doing things, and then we have informality, which is societal application of those rules, of how we reinterpret them and how we enact rules, which might be in a legal or illegal way, or might be, overlapping. So it's really about, I think, sort of relationships between something that we imagine as a two ends of a spectrum, but it's never two ends, it's always mixed. So in that sense, I think the terms are, they are useful as long as we are not replicating the binary, and we are able to really look more at the shifts that are happening rather than some sort of a situation in a given moment of time, because it's always changing, it's always fluid, it's always intertwined. So it's about this relationality, I believe, and in that sense, it helps to lay out some concepts, and for us, I guess, a little bit to take it away from exactly thinking about it only informality as something precarious. It's about shift of the rules between also high income contexts and like Airbnb, macro living, something that we seem to be completely formal, but actually it's not if we look at the shifts in law and regulations.
Yeah, I think also, just to add, like just a very brief anecdote, like both my parents back in England have businesses, and if somebody pays in cash, maybe they get a different price to if they pay by card. And I noticed that Greeks always have this image of England as this super formalized place, but this is just a cliche as well about the West being where it's more formal and everywhere else being less formal. I mean, people act informally everywhere, and kind of it's like, oh, it's informal, it's bad if it doesn't benefit me, but if I'm the one paying and the guy says, you can pay £10 less if you pay with cash, oh, that was good informality, So in the end, it's everywhere.
Yeah. What I wanted to add is that I also personally, and like in my research, I would like to move away from the binary of formality and informality. But I think it's important to still address informality in order to address the risks, to address the struggles, and to address the problems that come with informality. Of course, like it's a spectrum. There are problems connected to formality and to informality, and like a lot of different expressions. But at least in my case, I felt like from a spatial perspective, when we talk about a more informal setting, we have a lot of very, very basic risks, and climate change affects these people differently. They don't have the same access that I do to schooling, to housing, to other types of services, and they're a lot more vulnerable, let's say, socially. So I think, like from a spatial perspective, it's still relevant, not to address it as a binary, but or as a problem, but to openly address the risks that are related to it, I would say.
I have a question on the case of Kenya that you mentioned. Hello, yeah. I have a question on the case of Kenya. Like from the big slum in Mumbai, I know that it also not just works as a place where the people live, but also as like an economic center. So from there, like the de-housing projects or like the replacement projects, the people rejected that because that would have meant that they would lose also like their business and like the connection to the economy within the slum. So I was wondering if that was also the case, or if it was really just about housing or like living within the slum and not like the connection to the economy. Mm-hmm.
So this project actually tried to address the livelihood issue. So what we had is, like, spatially, the intervention was that outside the walls of the estate, there were stalls installed there for the people to transfer their businesses from their housing in the slum area to these stalls. And this part of the project was actually successful. These stalls are indeed being used, and then there is also like some kind of small businesses that are either installed in a place or ephemeral within the estate. So people still participate in the economy of the area actively, but I think there's kind of more to that, and this is what I'm actually kind of looking for right now, because livelihood formation can come from your job and how you make your income, but I think there's something more to that we're kind of missing, that doesn't let these people have a more stable income and thus better access to services.
Maybe it's the end. No, I'm maybe very quick. I'm interested with what you mentioned about the societal kind of rejection of idea of social housing, which is interesting. But I must say that, you know, I'm from Poland, so in Polish context there was also discussion like that. But after years, I think, you know, the privatization was rooted in these beliefs that, you know, like a socialist system was wrong, but now when the housing crisis strikes us so hard, it just re-entered the debate, and people are very in favor of social housing. So I'm wondering, you know, so many years after the collapse of the system, is there still that, or is it sometimes a narrative which just helps state not to deliver what they should? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think from some of the people I've spoken with in Tirana, there is hope that joining the EU would sort of change attitudes on these issues towards Europe is always, people sort of fancy of Europe as the opposite of their own country, right? So they're like, hopefully when we're in Europe, people are going to embrace social housing or something like that. But I think in Albania, you know, it transitioned very chaotically into capitalism, and you had, the state collapsed twice in the 90s. You had the emergence of the Albanian mafia, and then, you know, you had large numbers of refugees from Kosovo and so on. It was just a mess, to be honest. And what you've had in the 2000s under Rama is this sort of authoritarian, libertarian system emerge, which is actually very on brand right now. You know, you'd see it all around the world, and I think it's very telling that, so Albania has one island, just one, Sazan, and it's been sold to the Trump family earlier this year to develop as a luxury resort. And so this sort of, government by one man at the center of politics for a quarter of a century, with a sort of libertarian attitude towards regulation and development. I mean, I think Albania's pathway is a bit different to what's happened in Poland, but also the history is different. I mean, Poland had, prior to its communist period, it had a history as an independent country. Albania didn't, and you didn't really ever have a sort of democratic period in Albanian history. So it's sort of had a very chaotic start. And, another thing would be that the housing crisis in Albania manifests a lot of young people just leave. And it's even been suggested to me that the government wants that, because the sort of people who leave are the sort of people who are troublemakers anyway. So if they would stay and protest and cause problems, maybe it's better that they leave. I wonder if that's the case in Greece as well. I don't know, maybe someone could tell me about that. But I found that a really shocking solution to the housing crisis, that either you put up with it or you just go, because we don't want you to keep complaining. So it's a really unusual context, but I think you might find that elsewhere in the Western Balkans. That's what it's been suggested to me. I don't know.
Can I also ask something about Tirana?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I wanted to ask if all these new developments that are so fancy and designed by architects are also displacing people in a way, or how is this situation evolving?
I should have talked about that because it was the title. So in 2019 you had an earthquake in Albania, and it did destroy some buildings, but not very many. But the government used this as a pretext that all these communist blocks are so lethal that people need to get out. And I think they used this 3% contribution from developers to pay people's rents on the private sector for 2 or 3 years. And then they had to, so you had large parts of the city opened up for development. So they have effectively been displaced because they were in prime real estate. But those towers are empty. I mean, you see them at night, like 70% vacant. And then, of course, the hope is that this spectacle of development is going to drive investment into Albania. So that's going to have more, you'll have real development taking place alongside this facade of development, and that will displace people. I mean, the salaries are so low. It's what really shocked me. I was interviewing some real estate agents, and they were saying, we earn 400 euros a month. And I showed you that the sort of price per square meter can be 1,800. How do you live here? So yeah, it's happening, and they just get displaced out of the country, if anything else. So it's a really big problem in Albania, this outflow. And I don't know that joining the EU is going to actually reduce the outflow of people. Yeah.
Do we have other questions? No? So, okay, thank you everyone. We can close the session and move to other ones. I hope you will enjoy the conference. As you know, it's 3 days. So, thank you, everyone, and thanks to the speakers.